Hello, Dr. Lyons here, and we're still in chapter 14. Now we're on the second part of chapter 14. In this part, we're going to talk about coral reefs, but instead of talking about their general biology like we did in the last video lecture, we're going to talk about the threats to them and the solutions the solutions that exist that we can use to do a better job protecting our coral reefs worldwide. So probably the biggest threat to corals, and so the one that we'll talk about first, because it's the most important, is coral bleaching. So first, let's talk a little bit about what coral bleaching is in general. So coral bleaching is when corals spit out their zooxanthellae. So you'll remember from the last video lecture that a coral is a mix of two different things, right? So it's a cnidarian, so it's an actual heterotrophic cnidarian animal, and inside of that coral lives zooxanthellae, so single-celled algae. And those single-celled algae photosynthesize and produce sugars, and they give a lot of their sugars to the corals. So what coral bleaching is when a coral expels the zooxanthellae that were living inside of it. It kicks the zooxanthellae out. And why it's called bleaching is because a coral turns bright white when this happens. The reason why it turns bright white, some of you might remember from the last video lecture that the color that a coral has actually comes from the zooxanthellae that live inside of it. A coral itself is actually clear and the skeleton underneath is white. So when a coral kicks out its zooxanthellae, now what you're actually seeing is just the clear tissue and the white skeleton underneath, which is why corals will appear a really bright white color when they are bleaching. So let's talk about what causes this to happen. Why is it that corals will suddenly kick out their zooxanthellae? So the most common thing that is occurring now that is causing coral bleaching is extreme temperature events, right? So when the temperatures get too warm, this will cause corals to bleach. And in fact, we've gotten really good now at predicting when bleaching is going to happen based on how hot the water is in an area and for how long that water has been so hot. Excess nutrients and eutrophication that can cause bleaching, UV exposure that can cause bleaching, but by far the one that is causing the bleaching the most, and the cause of the bleaching that you'll hear about in the news is coming from extreme temperature. So let's talk about, well, who is responsible here? The coral for kicking out the zooxanthellae or the zooxanthellae for doing something to cause them to get kicked out? So it's really kind of both. Right, so the corals are in fact kicking out their zooxanthellae, but why they're doing that is that when temperatures warm up, that causes physiological stress to the zooxanthellae. The zooxanthellae get all stressed, they get all freaked out. Imagine if you were to come to class and I was to say, okay, we have an exam today, and you forgot that you had an exam, right? So imagine the stress that you're having in that moment. The zooxanthellae, they get stressed when it's too hot for them. And when they get too stressed, they start to produce chemicals that are actually toxic to the corals. They produce what are known as reactive oxygen species, which are very, very harmful chemicals. They're actually harmful to us as well. This is why you in your food you will have antioxidants, which are really useful for getting rid of those bad reactive oxygen species. So anyway, corals, when they feel those reactive oxygen species in them, they say this isn't good, and so they kick out their zooxanthellae as a response to that. And so when they do kick out their zooxanthellae, there's kind of two things that then can happen. If the conditions that cause those zooxanthellae to be stressed go away, so if the temperatures cool off, essentially corals can take up more zooxanthellae from the water around them. So they can say, okay, you can come back in now. And if the zooxanthellae behave, then they will reestablish and recolonize inside of the coral, and the coral will survive and it will go back to normal. But if the conditions that cause that stress persist, so if the warm waters stay warm for way too long, then the coral just can't take up more zooxanthellae, and then the coral eventually dies. And why it dies, has to do with the relationship between the corals and the zooxanthellae. So we learned back in the last chapter, or last video, I should say, that corals get a lot of their food from zooxanthellae, right? The main things that the two are trading with each other is the corals provide a shelter for the zooxanthellae, and the zooxanthellae provide food in the form of sugars from photosynthesis to the corals. So if the corals don't have their zooxanthellae, they don't have their main source of food. So what essentially happens is they starve to death because they don't have that main source of food in order to feed themselves and to have their metabolism run. So that is essentially what bleaching is. So warm water causes zooxanthellae to become stressed. The corals kick out the zooxanthellae because of the chemicals that the zooxanthellae produce. And if the corals can't get more zooxanthellae back inside of them, then they starve to death. So unfortunately, bleaching events are becoming more and more frequent because extreme warm temperature events are becoming more and more frequent, right? And this is something that we're kind of getting more and more used to here in California. The main effect that we're feeling here in California from these warm temperatures is that we're having more extreme fire events, right? When we have really, really hot, dry summers and hotter and drier summers than we used to in the past, we end up having these big wildfires in the West and in California. So when we are having big wildfires, it tends to be the case that corals are bleaching. So when we're having these extreme events where the air temperatures are really, really hot, that causes water to be really hot, and that is what causes bleaching. So in 2015, or in late 2014 into 2015, there was a massive bleaching event that affected the Great Barrier Reef. So in the late part of 2014, so December of 2014, corals were completely healthy, but then by like January, February, corals started to bleach along the Great Barrier Reef. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh, that's weird because that's the winter time. But the thing is, that's our winter time. In Australia, that is their summertime because they're in the southern hemisphere. So the water temperatures got really, really hot. Corals started bleaching, and a huge amount of corals died along the Great Barrier Reef. Right, so in the northern third of the Great Barrier Reef, so hundreds of kilometers of reef, roughly 81% of the corals were severely bleached and didn't recover. In the middle part, something like 33% bleached, and in the lower part, very, very few corals bleached. The reason why you have this gradient of most bleaching to least bleaching has to do with geography, right? So the equator is kind of like up here, and the closer to the equator you are, the warmer you tend to be. So the corals on the northern part of the Great Barrier Reef were the ones that suffered the worst because the temperatures got the hottest there. And so unfortunately, I have to report to you that this is now happening again as I'm recording this lecture. Right, so in late March, early April of 2020, another massive bleaching event started happening in the Great Barrier Reef. And it seems like it is going to be just as bad as this bleaching event that occurred in 2014 and 2015. However, in 2014 and 2015, it got a lot of news attention because it was this big, massive thing. Of course, right now, not many people are paying attention to bleaching the Great Barrier Reef because we have coronavirus happening right now. Right, so the news is pretty much dominated by coronavirus, but at the same time, we have this bleaching going on in the Great Barrier Reef. So I've got bad news, everyone. The Earth is going to hell. We're all dying from coronavirus, and the corals are bleaching. So it's a really, really bad time right now. But I am going to tell you at the end of the chapter, we're going to talk a little bit more about the things that we can do to help coral reefs. Because unfortunately, the threats to coral reefs are very, very real. And bleaching is a very, very real threat to coral reefs. So kind of a related, a threat to coral reefs that is kind of related to bleaching is ocean acidification. So ocean acidification has the same root cause that bleaching does, right? So bleaching results from warmer temperatures in the atmosphere, which results in warmer temperatures in the ocean. And that comes from too much carbon dioxide being in the atmosphere, right? So throughout the past, 200 years, as humans have become industrialized, we've started burning more and more fossil fuels, which means there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which has led to those extreme temperatures that causes coral bleaching. So large amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have also led to ocean acidification. So with more and more CO2 in the atmosphere, the oceans have become increasingly acidic. And I'll talk a little bit about the chemistry behind that in a minute. And when you do the ocean acidification lab, you're going to learn more and more about this phenomenon and about the chemistry behind it. So the kind of main issue here to corals is that corals calcify to grow, right? So they add calcium carbonate onto their skeletal system just like we do. But when the ocean waters become increasingly acidic, it becomes harder and harder and harder for corals to calcify. So it essentially makes it harder for them to grow. So, so the changes to our climate are kind of causing a sort of like double whammy to corals. So the temperatures are getting too warm and causing them to bleach. And then on top of that, the water is getting more and more acidic, which makes it harder for them to grow. So increases in acidity slow calcification. Okay, and let's talk about why that is. So how corals grow and how actually a lot of things in the ocean grow that have shells and have skeletons is they take up Ca2 plus, which is calcium, and they take up CO3 minus 2, which is carbonate. So they're taking up calcium and carbonate from the water, and they're combining those things and using those things to make calcium carbonate, which is the principal this is the principal compound that is in the skeleton of a coral. It's also the principal, thing that's inside, say, the shells of bivalves, inside of the shells of crabs and lobsters. So what we're talking about here doesn't just apply to corals. It applies to anything that has a shell or a skeleton in the ocean. So with more burning of fossil fuels, we have more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But a lot of that carbon dioxide doesn't stay up there. It goes into the ocean, which is great for our climate because that means that there's less CO2 in the atmosphere causing our climate to warm. But it causes other problems for the ocean. So when CO2 goes into the ocean, so when carbon dioxide enters the ocean, it combines with water and forms something known as H2CO3. So any of you that have taken chemistry either in high school or maybe in college might remember that molecules that start with H's tend to be acids. And that is exactly what this is. This is carbonic acid. And what acids do in general that make them an acid is they give off hydrogen ions. So one of the H's on this H2CO3, it'll pop off of this. So there will be more H's, more hydrogen ions in the water, which is why the ocean is getting more and more acidic, because there's more hydrogen ions in the ocean making the water more acidic. So where this becomes a problem for corals is that CO3 minus 2, so carbonate, it will act as what's known as a buffer. So a buffer is something that will neutralize an acid. It will take away the effect of an acid. And how it does that is combining with hydrogen ions. So all of those excessive hydrogen ions that we talked about a minute ago that are now in the water, they start combining with carbonate, and carbonate neutralizes that acid. So that is great because it makes the water less acidic, but what it means is that there is less carbonate in the water now. So the more hydrogen ions that go into the water, the more carbonate there is attaching to hydrogen ions and disappearing. So essentially the concentration of carbonate in the ocean is going down. And that is problematic for things like corals and clams and crabs because all of those things need that carbonate to grow their skeletons or their shells. There's still plenty of calcium for them in the water, but if there's not enough carbonate for them in the water, then they just can't grow their shells. they've essentially lost one of the building blocks that they use for making their shells. It would be like trying to make a building without using concrete, right? It's very hard to make a building without concrete because you need it for various things. And so it's very difficult for a coral or a crab or a clam to make their skeleton or shell without the essential molecules that they need to build their shells. So that is why ocean acidification is such an issue for things that have skeletons and have shells in the ocean, because it's going to be harder and harder for those things to grow their skeletons and shells in the future. Okay, so there's a couple other threats I want to talk about to coral reefs. In one of them you see in this picture. So this is what is known as a crown of thorns sea star. And so this sea star is a specialist in eating corals, right? So it devours corals and is covered by these thorny things, which makes it very difficult for them to have predators, right? Not a lot of things will eat these sea stars. So the issue with these things is that they will become super abundant super rapidly. So you will go from there being no crown of thorns sea stars in the area to there being hundreds, if not thousands upon thousands of these sea stars in an area. So they will kind of bloom in abundance and they will sweep through an area and they kill and eat all of the corals in that area. So why this happens is not completely well known. This may in fact actually just be a natural phenomenon that these sea stars will be, not really present and then they'll be super abundant super rapidly. Probably the best hypothesis as to what's going on here has to do with algal blooms. So when there's a big bloom of phytoplankton, a big bloom of things like diatoms and dinoflagellates, the planktonic larvae of these sea stars can become more abundant because they have more food available to them. However, whether that is why these things actually bloom in abundance is not completely well known yet. Okay, another threat to corals are diseases. So corals, just like us, they can be negatively affected by pathogens that can get inside of them. So what you see here are three different very common diseases that you find amongst corals in the Caribbean. And in the Caribbean, so that is in the Atlantic, so like the Atlantic coast of Central and South America and places like Cuba and Puerto Rico and Florida, that area, the Caribbean, has been particularly hard hit by a lot of different coral diseases. And so you might be looking at like this picture and thinking, oh, that looks actually more like bleaching. That doesn't look like a disease. So how you can tell a diseased coral from a bleached coral is that with diseased corals, there'll be kind of a gradient from completely light tissue to dark, colorful tissue. So you have a gradient of color. Whereas when it's a disease, there's a hard boundary. So here, this is the diseased tissue, and this is the live and healthy tissue. And so this disease that you see here, this is what's known as white plague. This is known as white band because it forms a white band along the tissue. And this is what is known as black band. And how these diseases work in general is they kind of spread across the coral, killing more and more of the tissue. So back here, this is tissue that's already been killed by the disease. And this disease is spreading very slowly across this coral, killing the tissue as it goes. So like this tissue here is still alive, but just barely. And then this tissue here has been dead for a while and is now completely covered by algae. Okay, and so there's one type of disease I want to talk about in a little bit more detail. So I want to talk about White-Pox disease, which are these white splotches that you see right here. And they occur on Elkhorn coral, which is this type of coral right here. And so this coral used to be very, very abundant throughout the Caribbean, right? So throughout the Atlantic coastline of Central America, from Mexico all the way down to Panama, and then throughout the northern coast of South America, let's see, that's in Colombia and in Venezuela, and then through the island nations in the Caribbean and up into Florida. So in the kind of early 90s, people first started noticing this disease on Elkhorn coral. So this is a graph showing the abundance of Elkhorn coral, whose scientific name is Acropora palmata, It's showing the abundance of those corals over time. And so you can see the general trend is that it's decreasing. So there's less and less of those corals over time. But there is another part of this graph that I want you to notice. So you're seeing this declining, but there's a particular way that the coral is declining. Right, so you might notice that this looks almost kind of like a set of stairs where it's flat and then it drops, then it's flat, then it drops, then it's flat, then it drops. And I want you to look at the timing here, right? So for instance, from October of 1996 through June of 1997, we see it's flat, which means that we didn't lose any Elkhorn coral during that period of time. And during that period of time, from October through June, I want you to think about the seasons that are occurring there. So this is in Florida, so northern hemisphere, meaning that October is in the fall, then November, December, now we're into winter, and then January, February, March, April into spring, and then into June, early summer. So that is when the water is going to be the coldest because it's the fall, it's the winter, spring, and early summer. So during that time, you don't see a drop in the corals. But then you see from June of 97 through September of 97, through the peak of the summer, you see a big drop in the abundance of corals. So that should tell you that this has to do with water temperature. That when the waters are warmer, that's when you see the corals drop in abundance the most. And so some scientists from Florida, they did a really, really good study on this, where they linked this disease to a particular bacteria known as Serratia marchensis. And so kind of the interesting thing about Serratia marchensis is that it is a bacteria that is commonly associated with our gut, with our digestive tracts. So it seems like what is going on here is that when you have sewage systems that are, that are not 100% effective at preventing wastewater from getting into the ocean, you have this bacteria, going into the sewage, and that bacteria is getting out onto reefs, where they then infect Elkhorn coral and cause that Elkhorn coral to have White-Pox disease. And what those same scientists found then in a follow-up study to the original study where they identified Serratia marchensis, they found that in the lab, Serratia marchensis is a lot tougher and grows better and lives longer in warmer conditions than in colder conditions. So essentially you have this bacteria from our gut going through, through toilets, through the sewage systems. Some of it is leaking out onto reefs. And when the waters are warmer, that bacteria is emboldened and it's stronger and it will have a bigger effect on the corals. And so this is kind of what is going on with that particular disease. And temperatures are kind of a common thing with coral diseases. As waters are getting warmer, the corals are getting more and more physiologically stressed, and the pathogens that can harm them are getting stronger and stronger with those warmer temperatures. So again, it's this sort of like double whammy where the pathogens that affect the corals are bad, but then they're worse when temperatures are warmer. Okay, another threat to corals, although probably a lesser threat than things like diseases and bleaching, is actually scuba divers. So scuba divers are definitely, scuba diving itself is definitely a great thing, I would say, because when a person goes scuba diving and sees a coral reef, they are instantly in love with coral reefs and want to do everything that they can to help and protect those coral reefs. However, corals can be loved to death, right? So when scuba divers, like sit on corals or stand on corals like this, that is very bad for the corals. That can in fact kill those corals. And myself and some other scientists did a research study on the effect of corals, on the effect of scuba divers on corals. And so what we did is in the island of Bonaire, which is the island that I've mentioned before that my wife and I lived on. So a small island off the coast of, so this is Venezuela down here, and Bonaire is approximately right there, just a little bit north of Caracas. And in Bonaire, there's a lot of scuba divers. And there are areas where there'll be a lot of scuba divers and areas where there are fewer scuba divers. So kind of the most important finding that I want to talk about is that if you look at how much of the seafloor is covered by corals, in areas where there's very little diving traffic, you find that the seafloor is roughly like 23% covered by corals. But in areas where there's heavy diving traffic, you find that the seafloor is, maybe more like 15% covered with corals. So there's a big drop in the abundance of corals in the areas where there is more scuba divers. The effect that that then has on the total reef is that the reef gets flatter. So we looked at what's known as rugosity, which is a measure of just how much the seafloor is going up and down, right? So just how complex is the seafloor, right? So does the seafloor look, a lot like this, with lots of like cracks and crevices and places for fish and things to live inside, or is it just completely flat? So the higher on this graph, it means the more complex the reef is. And what we found is that in the areas where there is very light diving traffic, the seafloor is more complex than in areas where there is very heavy diving traffic. So you can kind of see that here and here. Light diving traffic, more complex than where there is heavy diving traffic. So when there's lots of divers in the area, the seafloor just gets flatter, which means that there's going to be less things living in those areas because there's just less space for them to hide in. So that's the threat that divers cause to reefs. So what that means is if you ever go scuba diving or snorkeling, be very careful of the corals. Because I think a lot of people, when they go underwater, they see coral and they just think that it's like a rock or something that's not actually living, but it is a living thing. And if you kick it, you could actually cause harm to it. So be careful of the seafloor when you go in the ocean. Okay, one last threat, two corals that I want to talk about, and then we'll talk about some more of the solutions to these threats. Is I want to talk a little bit about issues of coral reefs shifting from being dominated by corals to being dominated by algae, so dominated by seaweeds. And so there's a pretty good example of this happening in the island of Jamaica, which is in the central part of the Caribbean. And in this story includes a few different kind of key players. So it includes the actual corals. It includes these fishes. So this is a parrotfish, and this is what is known as a surgeonfish. And they are herbivores, meaning they eat algae. This algae, this is obviously another player. And then finally, this thing, sea urchins, which are echinoderms, they are another player in this. In these echinoderms, they are herbivores just like these fishes are. So what happened on the island of Jamaica is there was a shift from coral to algae. And this kind of shift was documented by this guy, Dr. Terry Hughes, who is now a retired professor in Australia. And there's kind of a few important things to consider here to kind of work through this story. The first important thing to consider is that corals and algae, they compete for space on the seafloor, right? So we learned all about intraspecific and interspecific competition back in the marine ecology chapter. And one of the main things that organisms compete for is space. So space to grow on the seafloor. So that's one important thing to consider. Another important thing to consider is that herbivores, such as fishes and urchins, consume a large amount of algae, right? So they eat that algae and they control it. So you can almost kind of think of this as a similar scenario to what you learned about with the keystone predator Pisaster with the sea star. So you might remember from the competition lab you did, or from the intertidal ecology or in rocky intertidal chapter, you learned that sea stars will eat mussels, and mussels compete with seaweeds for space. And so the effect of the sea stars is that they control the mussels, and that allows those seaweeds in rocky intertidal areas to have a chance of having some space on the seafloor. In this case, we're talking about herbivores, so fishes and urchins. They consume the algae, And that gives the coral a chance to have some space on the seafloor, because otherwise algae will cover the coral and kick out the coral. So herbivores in this case are kind of like the keystone predator. By controlling the algae, they give the corals a chance to survive. So that's another important thing to consider. Finally, one less important thing to consider is hurricanes. So there's going to be a hurricane in the story. And hurricanes are, of course, a natural thing, right? So hurricanes have occurred for a very long time. And hurricanes are, of course, very destructive to coral reefs. But corals have always been able to recover from hurricanes over time. You know, it does take time because corals grow very, very slowly, but they do recover from hurricanes. And so let's talk about what happened on the island of Jamaica. So one thing that happened is that the population of Jamaica has grown exponentially over time. So in the year 1860, there was somewhere on the order of, let's see, of 50,000 people living in Jamaica. Whereas now there's more like 300,000 people living in Jamaica, right? So there's been a big increase in the amount of people there. And, you know, all those people need to eat. You know, obviously they have to eat something. And what a lot of Jamaicans eat is food from the sea. And over time, a lot of the big predatory fish were fished out of the Jamaican waters. So they started eating herbivorous fishes. So they started eating parrotfishes and surgeon fishes. So as a result, those things are now gone, right? So we don't have those herbivorous fishes anymore. So that's one part of the story. Another part of the story is that there was a big hurricane in 1980. So this is what was known as, I believe, Hurricane Allen. And so you can see there's Jamaica right there. There's the hurricane. There's the eye of the hurricane. So you can see it hit Jamaica pretty directly. And so that caused a lot of the corals to get kind of knocked around and to get destroyed by the hurricane. So that's kind of then another part of the story. A third part of the story is that in 1983, a pathogen swept throughout the Caribbean, and that pathogen killed off sea urchins. So sea urchins plummeted in abundance. So those sea urchins, they went from being, you know, super, super abundant, you know, pretty much every dive you would see just tons of them, to them being, you know, kind of a rarity on coral reefs. So the sea urchins, so that other herbivore, they disappeared in 1983. Kind of the terrifying thing about this is that it's still not known what exactly that pathogen was that caused all of those urchins to go extinct. But that's what happened. So now today the urchins have started to kind of come back in the, you know, in the 30 plus years since then. But they've been very slow to recover, and they're not nearly as abundant as they were before. If you looked at the actual abundance of urchins, so before 1983, you would find something like 10 urchins per meter square of this species Diadema, which is this one urchin species, on the seafloor. So a meter square, that is, you know, that's about the size of like a kitchen table. So about, think of a square that's about 3 feet by 3 feet. So it used to be that you would find 10 of these urchins in that one area. Whereas now you find 1/10 of an urchin in that one area, meaning that you would have to look at 10 different dining room table sized areas just to find one urchin. So they plummeted in abundance. So essentially what happened is with the herbivores gone, uh, the algae essentially grew out of control. Uh, And with corals having just been knocked over by hurricanes, they just couldn't recover, right? So the hurricane really damaged the corals. And now because the algae is just growing unimpeded, because there's no herbivores to eat them, essentially the algae kicked out the coral. So you had this shift going from before it was dominated by corals to now it's dominated by algae. So if you look at a graph of percent coral cover and percent algae cover, I'm not sure. I copied this image from the internet, and for some reason it has all these exclamation points like 1970s, 1990s, 1000. I'm not sure why that is, so just ignore the exclamation points. But anyway, what we have on this graph is percent coral cover, so how much of the seafloor is covered by corals on the horizontal axis, and how much of the seafloor is covered by algae on the vertical axis. So in the 1970s and before that, huge amounts of the seafloor would be covered by corals. Big amounts between say like 30 and 80% of the seafloor was covered by corals, and less than 10% was covered by algae. But then by the 1990s and still through today, you find less than 10% of the seafloor is covered by coral and over 70% of it is covered by algae. So you had this major shift from a coral-dominated state to an algae-dominated state. So this is what is known as a phase shift, where we go from one phase, so being coral-dominated, to another phase being algae-dominated. Okay, so that's a lot of gloom and doom about corals. And to be fair, there is a lot of reasons to be pessimistic about corals because there are a lot of threats that face them. Probably more than any other ecosystem that we will talk about this semester, corals probably face the biggest challenges. But luckily, there are a lot of ways to help corals. So NOAA, which is part of the U.S. government, it stands for the what is it, like the Northern Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They have this really nice guide of ways to protect coral reefs, right? So one thing that we can do is choosing sustainable seafood. Right, so you just learned that herbivores are really, really important to coral reefs because they control the algae. So make sure that the fish that you're eating are not herbivores coming from coral reefs. And how you can do that is with something known as the Seafood Watch app, which I'm going to teach you about in a later chapter. Using less water is really important because we learned a little earlier ago about how sewage water can cause diseases to corals. So the less water we're using, the less water that we're making that is going into the ocean that could be transporting diseases to corals. Volunteering for reef cleanups or beach cleanups. We don't really have so much reefs around here, but we do have beaches that could use to be cleaned. And a lot of the plastic that might end up on the beach in Santa Monica, if that plastic goes into the water, it could end up on a coral. And it's been found that when plastics get wrapped around corals, they abrade the coral and make the coral more likely to die. So by going to beach cleanups, that can be a good way to help corals. And there is a nonprofit organization in Southern California known as Heal the Bay that organizes monthly beach cleanups. So check them out. I'm assuming probably not a lot of you give corals as gifts. If you are doing that, stop doing it. If you're not doing that, keep not doing that. Any way that we can reduce our carbon footprint is good. So that could include installing energy efficient light bulbs in your house. It could include, making sure to turn off lights, when you're not in a room. It would include, using more sustainable ways of getting around, whether it's public transit or carpooling or taking a bicycle. Obviously, like right now, as I'm recording this lecture, we're in the middle of a coronavirus outbreak. So maybe don't go, finding strangers to carpool with right now, but when all this blows over, start, think about, who you can carpool with to school, and how you can get around while using, less carbon. I talked before about how scuba divers and snorkelers can have a bad effect on reefs by standing on them. So if if you go to see coral reefs, be careful of them. The same goes for boating. If you are around coral reefs, watch where you drop your anchor. In terms of sunscreens, this is a really easy thing that we can all do. In sunscreens, there are certain chemicals that can be harmful to coral reefs. So when you buy sunscreens, especially sunscreens that you might wear when you're going in the ocean, make sure that they're coral-friendly sunscreens. You can find more information about coral-friendly sunscreens on that link right there. Uh, I guess that same goes for like chemicals. So if you have a lawn, please, don't, just overdo it with the fertilizer for your lawn because a lot of those nutrients go into the water, which can be bad for corals. And it's the same with, with like our solid trash, things like plastic and whatnot. As I was mentioning before, plastics can be really harmful to corals when they get wrapped around them. So try to use less plastic, so less single-use plastic bottles and less plastic bags. There's lots of really attractive tote bags out there now, and lots of really snazzy, aluminum water bottles, like multi-use water bottles that you can get so that you're not using as much plastic. Okay, so these are some of the things that we can do, in our own lives, in order to do good things for corals. So I want you to think about doing some of those things because corals definitely need our help. Okay. Okay, so that is all I've got to tell you about coral reefs for now. Uh, so I want you all to watch the documentary Chasing Coral on Netflix. If you don't have Netflix, I'll be setting up a Zoom an online Zoom screening of the movie for you. So more information about that to follow.